Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this podcast. I am super excited to be sharing with you a series of episodes where I answer questions that I received from my Instagram community. So a few weeks ago, I did the whole sticker thingamajig, and I told people, I was like, hey, I'm going to go on the podcast. I'm going to create some solo episodes of just me answering your questions as best as I can. And specifically, I was soliciting questions about learning astrology, and I got so many juicy questions. At first, I thought it was going to be this casual thing, but no. So much flowed out of me, and I just kept going and going. And I think if I were to compile all of these questions, they would be like 3 or 4 hours long, maybe a little bit more. So first of all, thank you for everyone who submitted the question, because I really love answering questions about learning astrology. If you love me answering questions about astrology, I would love to know, because maybe I'll do more of these episodes. It was just so fun to create. Just a reminder before we get into it that my course with Britton LaRue, Astrology as Praxis, will be starting on September 10th, 2022, and registration will be on August 26th to 28th. I'm super excited to not only be teaching astrology, but also to explore various pathways that you can use to integrate astrology, individually as well as in a community. Using astrology, yes, to help you understand yourself, right? That is definitely the point of this class. But also to expand your idea of who you are as a cosmic being and your role, your participation, your agency within this larger cosmic body. It's really a robust container, a beautiful, sturdy curriculum where we really actively invite in all of our faculties, right? Our mental, intellectual faculties, our emotional, spiritual, somatic faculties, to participate in learning and ultimately unlearning astrology and creating the astrology that we need and want in this moment. Check out our course page if this resonates. All of that will be in the show notes below. Okay, so back to the questions. Because they were all so rich, I really didn't want to fit this into 1 or 2 episodes, because I think that might be a little overwhelming given how the episodes have so many different topics. And so I'm trying a new format here where I'm going to break it up into many different smaller pieces. So you're going to see episode 26 to 31 being these Q&A episodes. Episode 26 is where I cover a couple questions. One of them is really about what to say or how to deal with naysayers of astrology. And then the other one was really about how do we reconcile being a unique individual, right, with unique birth charts, as well as being, categorizable using the language of astrology. And so to me, these 2 questions are a little bit more philosophical, and they really speak to like this duality of like the inner skeptic and the outer skeptic. So I grouped them together, and then episode 27 is my personal recommendations on learning astrology. So if you are interested in doing that and you think you will benefit from, a list of resources and me kind of reviewing those resources, listen to episode 27. Episode 28 is pretty technical. It's where I talk about houses, aspects, and stellium. I find that these 3 subjects are really the subjects that are for like advanced beginner astrology students are very much like alive, because we don't tend to talk about houses or aspects in like memes, so people don't really know about it that much. So if you feel ready to go into like the nitty-gritty of astrology, go to episode 28 for houses, aspects, stellium. And then episode 29 is where I talk a little bit about my current approach to interpreting natal chart, as well as where I stray from tradition. So this is an interesting episode. I think this one may be the more controversial one, if that's what you're into. Episode 30 is like my astrology ritual and practices, as well as a major life transit, which in this case, Pluto transiting through my very packed fifth house. So episode 29 and 30 are both a bit more on the personal side. Like they're really kind of my take on things. So if that's what you're interested in, or if you're interested in hearing my life story and my journey with Pluto, then definitely listen to episode 30. But both of them are pretty personal. And then episode 31 are really the miscellaneous questions that I couldn't really find a place for in the other episodes. They're really about Lionsgate and then housing contract and Chiron in Cancer. So yeah, I hope that you enjoy these episodes. Please also know that if you're listening to an episode where there are numerous questions, you can always skip ahead using the timestamps below in the show notes, right? So yeah, that hopefully will come in very handy, and you will find that very useful. If you are like, oh, I'm not really interested in this question, just jump ahead. And then finally, all of the intros are going to be the same for episodes 26 to 31. So you can, if this is your first time listening to the intro, well, you got to the end of it. And if this is your second episode that you're exploring, then totally just skip to the questions, right? Don't feel like you need to listen to the intro again. And you can use the timestamps for that. Okay, cool. That's me being my Virgo rising self, letting you know about all of the little details. And I think that's it. So enjoy this episode. Actually, more like this series of episodes that are super juicy, super exciting, pretty nerdy, and I will see you on the other side. This question is from Eloisa. What are your daily or weekly astrology practices and rituals? This is a great question. I would say that my most primary astrology practice and ritual is actually talking to people using astrology. It may not seem like a practice in the way that we generally or traditionally define that to be, but it really is to me. Maybe it's my chart, maybe it's my personality, maybe it's my Gemini moon that's ruled by my 7th house Mercury in Pisces, but I would say that this is really the primary way that I use astrology. I just get so much and I learn so much out of talking to people, whether they're classmates or professional astrologers that I get readings from, clients or friends that I read for, students, or even just random people online. I mean, honestly, this is probably a little funny to admit, but I remember I used to do this a lot. I have been doing less and less of this because I'm getting my fix of talking about astrology or about someone's chart a lot these days. But in the early days, before I started doing consults regularly, I used to, so I'm a member in many different astrological communities out there, like random Facebook groups or like Reddit groups, right? I'm not talking about like really legit groups. Okay, I'm not saying that Facebook groups or Reddit groups are not legit, but I'm not talking about like groups that are really formal, like Kira's like 11th house, for example, or something like that. I'm really talking about like just, good old like astrology forums, right? That are out there. I used to go on those before I did regular consults, and I would just like practice reading random people's charts and then just like writing down my delineations. Seriously, I used to be that like obsessed about it that I was not even doing that with like a person I could see. It was just like people that I met on like these groups. And honestly, I didn't make so many friends out of these places, but I've definitely made a couple friends that actually have stayed with me. And some of them, I think one of them, I stayed really good friends with. So maybe that's something that you might want to do if you are listening out there and you are, curious about what it's like to read people's chart. I feel like reading strangers' charts online can be a really good practice. To me, astrology really creates conversations, and that's what I find to be the most exciting about it. You may have heard me talk about this before, but I almost named this podcast Future Language because I really feel like using astrology to communicate with one another and to ponder our lives as both individuals and within this greater web of life truly enriches our lives. In general, I think my ritual and my practice with astrology is that I just study astrology like a shit ton, like a ton. I think that the way I study has become more scattered over the years, and I've kind of let it become scattered because that's just how my brain works. I tend to be reading like a bunch of different books at the same time. I skip over left and right. I jump around from one online course to another, especially when they're self-paced. And also, I think that, allowing myself to create astro-related content or reflections and then share them online has been a huge practice for me as well. To me, learning is such an important practice because there's something about learning that really helps me to continue to stay inspired, to stay fresh, to stay humble, and also to continually question what I think I know. So what I really mean by this is that, when you read a bunch of different books, for example, even when you read, let's say 2 modern astrologers, right, that I can think of off the top of my head right now, Jeffrey Wolf Green versus Rick Tarnas. They have very different significations about Pluto, I mean, not very different, but it's different enough that I feel like confusions and dissonance can arise. And I tend to love dissonance. I tend to love discord when it comes to learning because I just don't think that there is one way. And the moment that my brain starts to solidify what I'm learning into like just that one thing, that's when I know that I'm in a very dangerous territory. So I basically really like to learn and to question, really as a practice of love and devotion. And then more privately, I've been doing a lot of planetary channeling. And this is something that I think is becoming much more entangled with my own energy work and my Akashic practices. And it also this practice has really been born out of those practices, like my energy as well as my Akashic practices and my general meditation practices. It also is something that I have been inspired by one of my teachers, Diana Rose Harper. I remember Diana once did these like planetary prayers and like meditating with the planets that she did with her Patreon community for over 7 days, or I think for the whole 7 days. She would have these meetups where she would guide people through like meditation and prayers and just kind of general connecting with the planet. So, something I should mention is that other than attending those meetups and then also reading one of Diana's posts about it, I never actually studied this formally, and I'm putting air quotes on that. Like, I've never really studied this formally with Diana. So it's more like, I feel like she introduced me to the concept, and then I kind of built a practice from there that makes sense to me, and really a practice that grew out of my own energy work practices. There's an article that Diana wrote called A Primer on Planetary Prayers, or How to Start Praying to the Planets, which I will link below. To me, this has been a really interesting practice because depending on what you consider prayers, and I think Diana kind of touched on this a little bit in that article as well, my work with them, I wouldn't really call them prayers because it's more like I'm just talking to them. Like, I would have questions and I would feel into what their answers are. And then I let myself listen and receive the information that I got from them, which is very much, I would say, a template that I borrowed from my Akashic practice, because that's how my Akashic practice is. I would have like maybe a list of questions, and then I would just kind of listen for the answer. And over time, you develop a sense of like, is this really the Akashic field or the Akashic records or whatever you want to call them? Is this really them talking, or is it like coming from me? You know, to me, it's a rich area of exploration. And I think there are also like preferred ways and topics that certain planets like to talk to you about. So in my experience, like sometimes, I work the most with Mercury, and I find that Mercury is super chatty with everything. But is Mercury the best person to ask about, should I change my business name, or like, should I redo my website? Like things like that. Is that really the best question for Mercury? I don't know, maybe. But I think depending on your relationship with these planets, over time, you'll get a sense of like, oh, maybe relationship problems are better for Venus than for Mars, maybe, in terms of getting you out of stagnancy. Maybe that's more a Mars dominion. But I would say like really be open to receiving. Another way you can do this too is just to open to all the different planets, right? To all the planetary forces, archetypes, guides, ancestors, whatever you want to call them. And then just let whoever come forward, right? That has the best guidance for you, or the most expansive, the most expanding guidance for you. Let them come forward, My first recommendation, if something like this is interesting to you, is to almost forget about your birth chart. To me, like coming into it with a childlike mindset of being like, tell me, and then just kind of cultivating a practice of listening is almost more effective than allowing so much of your own preconceived notion about what the planets can and cannot do to infiltrate the practice. And this can be hard, because the way that we've been studying astrology is so geared towards that, intellectual study, right? And we also have this, I think a lot of us who are attracted to astrology kind of has this propensity to want to talk about it, to want to discuss it, right? So the more we discuss, I think the more the energy around certain maybe planetary significations can really calcify, right? So it's a bit tough, but I think with a little bit of practice, and you just and cultivating a practice of listening and being open and not being so dogmatic about like how the guidance comes to you, you might receive something really interesting. If you would like, you can always ground this in your birth chart or kind of the current transit. But I found that if you get too stuck on that analytical portion too early, you kind of have got nowhere else to go. You corner yourself and then you just kind of get stuck. And so letting yourself put on the hat of like the Fool card of the tarot, really, I think that's a really powerful way of working with direct knowledge from the planets. To me, what I would recommend what I would recommend to any of you listening who found this interesting is to assume that you kind of know nothing about the planets, or how they're going to show up at any given day, right? Because really, if we engage in this practice, to me, it's like engaging in an assumption that the planets are animate beings, that they are infused with life force. And so, to me, it's kind of like relating to a really ancient teacher, or like even like, a really wise pet, right? Or like a really wise like spirit guide. Like you can't expect them to say the same thing every day. And so, of course, you won't be able to fully abandon your studies because that's all kind of part of the practice, but letting yourself be completely unencumbered by previous knowledge, I think, is really essential. I want to make sure here that I'm not saying that tradition is not useful or valuable or powerful. It really is, right? Because I think part of why we would want to work with these planetary energies too is because there's so much concentration of energy around them that's been built up over time, right? Be that from our culture or from mythology or just from the ways that people have been using and have been connecting to these archetypes. So I think there's like a force behind it, right? And at the same time, when I've been too stuck in the academic part of magic, personally for me, I tend to end up not doing it at all, because then I'm like, oh my God, I have to do it right. I have to do, I have to get all the right materials, everything has to be like exactly the way that like, the associations of Mars or the associations of Saturn needs to be exactly right. And then I'm just too bogged down by all these, limiting, concerns that I personally don't end up doing it at all. Now, I know that not everybody's like that, right? So there are some other people who might be like, oh, I really need guidance. And then that could be a really great place to start. But even then, I think allowing in a little bit of experimentation, irreverence, playfulness is really important. Take it or leave it, right? Like that might just be me because I have a Mercury rule chart, and in my life as a Virgo rising, it's like, yes, study, but unless you break the rules, you're not actually going to get it. That's what I've been learning, from my direct relationship with Mercury. So, yeah. I guess I want to close by saying a few things that I feel are important to share with regards to rituals and practices. The first one is that the most powerful practices are the ones that you actually do. Right? The most powerful rituals are the ones that you actually engage in with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole body, your whole spirit, right? So no matter how amazing the design of the practice or the ritual is, how much is vetted by people you think are so respected or so cool or so advanced, if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. So everyone really has to find their own way into it. And to me, this is where we can really divest, right, from the very colonial idea that like the insights are the point. To me, that's BS, because really the process is the point, right? The process, like you engaging in the process itself and the praxis of doing it, that's the result. So for some people, again, having the support of tradition is important because maybe you want to learn the rules in order for you to feel safe and supported and held. And that's absolutely beautiful. For some others, like me, it will completely hinder you at first, So maybe you'll have to just go with your intuition and just do it. And then maybe you will be stuck, in, at a certain point in your journey. And then maybe you can begin incorporating more of the formal study, right? But that can come later. And if you find yourself like studying, and then you never end up doing anything about it, then I think that's a really good sign that maybe you need to switch it up a little bit. I gave myself a lot of grief around how I didn't do enough of like planetary practices or exercises, etc., etc., etc. And looking back, I don't know. I feel like the definition of rituals and practice really needs to be expanded way further, because even studying, like even reading books, like that's a ritual. That's a practice. You listening to podcasts. Like for me, I don't strategically listen to podcasts. I just have them scattered all around. I listen to whichever one I want to listen to. I dip in and out, right? I'm a mess. And that's just how I am. And the more I allow myself to be that kind of messy, crazy learner, the more I can appreciate how that's my own unique way of learning and relating to the knowledge, right? Like studying is also relating, and it's really deep to relate through studying, because it's like, imagine, if you have a lover, right? Who is like, I'm going to, not in a creepy way, I'm going to, look at all the photo albums of you, right? From the time you were a child to the time when you were older, and like really study you as a human being. Or like someone who really takes the time to remember what your favorite items are on the menu for your favorite restaurants, Like how beautiful is that, right? Study is practice. Study is ritual. So if you are that person who really, your practice with astrology is studying, then that's great. You don't have to want to even engage in any of the magical practices. To me, like that boxing of like what is magical versus what is not magical is also kind of BS. Whatever. It's my hot take. I stand by it. If you struggle with creating practices or ritual, I would also remind you to cut yourself so much slack, right? There's nothing wrong with you. It takes time to establish rituals and practices, and sometimes to even realize what your rituals and practices are. I mean, before Eloisa even asked me this question, and I sat down to really reflect on this, I didn't even think that talking to people was my ritual, but it really is. It's something I do regularly and something I really enjoy doing, and every single time I do it, something magical happens. I mean, hello? What is that if not a ritual? What is that if not a practice, right? Again, I would say, something I would tell my younger self is, in the beginning, just don't get too bogged down by like rules and regulations, right? Start with something that you're already doing. Really start with where you are. If you like journaling, then start writing letters to the planets. If you like meditating, then start connecting with the planets in that way, right? Just call in whoever wants to come, If the moon wants to come, great, talk to the moon, right? If Jupiter wants to come, talk to Jupiter. And if you don't want to talk to Jupiter that day, and Jupiter was the one who came forward, just say, no, thank you, next, right? Like you can do that. You have a lot of agency. If you like tarot, then maybe start learning what associations are out there, and maybe begin incorporating it into your tarot interpretations, right? Like begin to see, what are the different planetary associations with tarot, and see if it makes sense for you. And see, if something doesn't make sense, make up your own associations, right? If you like talking to people, then find communities, online memberships. There are tons of like random free groups out there. There's one, that's called the 11th House by Deborah Silverman, I think, which is a Facebook group. And I always get so much interesting messages from there. I mean, not all of them maybe is like the best, but it's still interesting. It's still cool to see that there's such a huge community of people who are super into astrology and super into learning astrology, right? Start a podcast, talk to friends who are interested, read their birth charts, talk to them about their birth charts, talk to other astrologers, if you can't necessarily afford readings, then, support them in smaller ways and then interact with them in whatever way you can, right? My point is that often your practices and your rituals don't need to be this like well thought out thing, right? Chances are you're already doing something, and so begin there. Like really allow yourself to appreciate the rituals and the practices that you already have, and then see where that takes you. This question is from Jacqueline. Can you share some reflections and lessons from Pluto transiting your fifth? Or what have been major life transits for you? Thank you for asking this question, Jacqueline. And you know what? It's interesting because generally I have a little bit of a discomfort in talking about experiences that are very personal to me, especially when they're unsolicited. But also like publicly, right? I think with my upbringing, culturally, familially, I've really internalized a lot of like discouragement of that level of transparency because it was literally dangerous to the life of my ancestors to talk about their life stories. And so I have to admit that this is a bit of an edge for me. But at the same time, because you asked, dear Jacqueline, I feel that perhaps there's value in talking about them. And perhaps my hope is that, if anyone else is going through Pluto transits, whether on your fifth house or not, that can be something that's really useful for you. And I also know that for you, Jacqueline, specifically, Pluto has also been going through your fifth house. So hopefully some of what I'm sharing here inspires certain reflections, or at least gives you a sense of how I would look at it, right? Or how I kind of contextualize this. So first, let's talk about Pluto. Pluto really speaks to the underworld, both literally and metaphorically. Pluto speaks to destruction, to the process of decimation, right? If Uranus rebels or destroys stagnant energies, Pluto completely eradicates it, right? This is what Rick Tarnas said about Pluto. It is associated with all myths of descent and transformation, and with all deities of destruction and regeneration, death and rebirth. And then another modern astrologer who has written a lot about Pluto was Jeffrey Wolf Green. And this is what JWG said about Pluto. Pluto correlates to the soul and evolution. The soul is an immutable consciousness that has its own individuality or identity that remains intact from life to life. Within the soul, there exist two coexisting desires. One desire is for separate existence, to separate from that which created the soul. The other desire is to return to the source of creation. The interaction of these two apparently opposing desires instigates the drama of personal and collective evolution. Desire is the determining force. I was going to read factor, but desire is the determining force that dictates the reality of each individual. Pluto's house and sign placement describes two simultaneous phenomena. On the one hand, the natal position of Pluto describes the generational vibration that a person comes in with, as well as specific individualized patterns. On the other hand, the natal position of Pluto points to the evolutionary desire, intent, or cause of this life as seen in Pluto's opposite house and sign. So I know that seems like kind of a lot, but basically, right, to me it's really interesting because on the one hand, right, Rick Tarnas maybe spoke of it more in terms of like the myth surrounding Pluto, right? Thinking about Pluto or Hades as the underworld deity. And then Jeffrey Wolf Green spoke about it more as like the soul itself, right? So yeah, I'm just going to leave that there and let you kind of percolate all of these information, right? And the reason why I read mostly from modern astrologers is because really traditional astrology didn't really take into consideration the outer planets, right? So we really only have the modern astrologers to tell us about this. And then something I should say too is that, so Jacqueline was talking about Pluto being in Capricorn, right? Transiting through my fifth house. So I do have a stellium in the fifth house, or what I consider to be a stellium. I have Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, and Mars in the fifth house. And in another segment, when I was responding to questions about the houses, I spoke about the fourth house to fifth house journey. To me, there's something really interesting and poetic to consider with regards to the fourth house and the fifth house kind of journey, right? From an individual's perspective, we can see that the arc of the hero's journey is kind of present here a little bit, right? It's really where we leave the comfort zone and the trauma of our upbringing, and then we individuate as a person with a unique perspective and a voice to share. That's more from an individual perspective, right? Of the fourth house to the fifth house. And then from a more collectivistic perspective, maybe we can think of it as like the collective unconscious, according to Jung. And it feels like to me where we abandon this complicated, polluted colonial conditioning, right? And then we can move into creating new worlds dictated by what feels good to us, what's pleasurable, what's sensuous. It's kind of like that Adrienne Marie Brown term, right, of like pleasure activism, or maybe what I would call pleasure anarchy. In short, I would say that Pluto going through my fifth house has been a complete annihilation of what I thought my artistic practices are. And something that's interesting about Pluto that I should mention here is that the orbit of Pluto is really, like, it takes a really long time, right? I think this particular Pluto transiting through my fifth house was over a course of about 15 years, and it hasn't even fully ended yet. I think Pluto will start dipping into Aquarius in like spring of 2023, if I'm not mistaken. So my point is simply that, to really point it out to just Pluto is kind of tough because these transits are long, right? But, from what I've learned about Pluto, what I've experienced in my own Plutonic experiences and journeys, I would say that yes, there has been a complete overhaul of what I thought creativity is and how I express my creativity. I've always been a very creative person, with that fifth house in Capricorn stellium. I feel like I have always oriented myself towards art, right? And towards even thinking about my life as art. And yet, this period has really changed how I interact with my art and the form of my art. And also, I would bring in too the idea of romance, because to me, fifth house also speaks to romance and unique self-expression. So Pluto really entered Capricorn. So this is where I'm going to go a little bit like play by play, right? But I'm going to keep it relatively brief so as not to bore you maybe with my life. Whatever. Maybe you find this interesting. But Pluto entered Capricorn. So it's interesting when I did this, right? I noticed that Pluto kind of does this back and forth a little bit with all of the different planets that I have in my fifth house, because that's just the nature of Pluto, right? It moves very slow, and so it's almost like it touches the natal point and then it goes retrograde and then it touches it again and then it goes direct and it touches it again and then it leaves, right? So there's a little bit of this like back and forth like dance, and for most of them they're pretty much only the period of a year, and then for others like Pluto was on my Mars for basically about 2 years, so that was really intense. So Pluto entered Capricorn for me, the cusp of my fifth house, early 2008, and it left for it left 0 degree Capricorn after that little 3-part dance at the end of 2008, right? So this is an interesting period. I just moved to the US to study at Manhattan School of Music. I was studying classical piano, and so it was completely like a new environment, right? It was the reason why I brought up earlier about, the fourth house to the fifth house story was because I was literally leaving my home to study something that is related to my artistic practice, right? In a new land. So it was like saying goodbye. And you know what? Ever since I moved to the US, I have not spent a considerable amount of time back home in Indonesia, like not more than 4 months or so. So to me, that's pretty significant. If Capricorn has anything to do with like hard work, establishing foundations and things like that, Pluto's ingress, really maybe around this time has a lot to do with the digging out and the reconstitution of some of these foundations. I found myself really kind of starting anew because in the middle of 2008, I kind of serendipitously met a new piano teacher who totally changed the way I played. Like this teacher for about 3 months really gave me like a crash course almost of like a different technique of orienting to the piano. And yeah, like that was a huge, massive shift for me because suddenly I played piano completely differently. I don't know, for better or for worse. I think looking back, I was also very depressed during this period because I worked and practiced and studied so hard. And it was perhaps the beginning of when things started to crack a little bit because there was so much pressure that I felt around trying to be good at playing the piano that I think I lost a little bit of the love that I had for it when I was first starting out, which, you know, I started learning piano when I was 8, but really I became serious when I was 14 or 15. So not that long before I left and went to the US to study piano. And then the next chapter was when Pluto was on Uranus, right? So the way that I'm approaching your question here, Jacqueline, is I'm looking at the different like exact conjunctions between transiting Pluto and like my natal points, right? So when Pluto was on my natal Uranus was around like, it first came in around February of 2012 and then left December 2012. This was when I was in, and you know, it's funny because I actually checked the photos on my phone, and this was really the start of my very first serious queer relationship. Well, in fact, maybe it was my first relationship ever. It was interesting because I'm like, how much should I share about this? What I will say about it was that it was an extremely volatile relationship. The highs were very high, the lows were very low, and it's not entirely due to this person's fault, right? He was a Scorpio, so hello Pluto, and in many ways I think he was kind of everything I ever fantasized about, but ultimately realized that like this kind of relationship was not good for me. But also I was young, you know, I was still figuring out like how I like to be romanced or how I like to be in love, you know, because there are infinite ways to be in love. There are infinite ways of having relationships, and there are infinite ways of being romanced, right? So I was really young. I didn't really know my preferences that well. So yeah, this relationship particularly felt very deep and karmic. It took me a really long time afterwards to not still feel like I'm entertaining the possibilities of getting back together, even though consciously I knew that that's not what I wanted. Somehow, like, this person would like make regular appearances in my dreams, for example, you know? So like clearly my subconscious is still attached to the idea of this person until like pretty recently, actually. So there was also a lot of power struggles because we were both musicians. To me, power struggles are also very Plutonic themes, right? There was a lot of comparison, a lot of competition, not really from my end because I never really cared about those things, but yeah, but still, it was kind of, you know, the electricity was in that relationship. I would say upon reflection, it's interesting because Pluto, natally for me, it's not in the 5th house, right? It's on my 3rd house, and it's actually squaring my nodes. So I think also questions and concerns around empowerment and what it means to see my desire through to the end, even though it kind of, burned my ass, was a really important thing for me to learn during this period of time. And the reclamation of my power was also like a really slow, I would say Pluto's role was very much like kind of a slow cooker, right? Like it built up over a very long period of time. But Pluto really taught me about my own creative agency at this time. And that also includes romantic agency, because looking back, this relationship really taught me about my own power. And later on, I literally, after we broke up, right, I literally went on dates thinking and orienting towards the fact that I wanted the exact opposite of what this person represents to me and what this relationship represents to me. And I did end up finding a relationship that was the exact opposite. And that was actually really great. And, yeah, it also taught me something about like my, I guess like my desire in a relationship, thinking about like that 5th house Capricorn, right? I am less concerned apparently about like, being romance or having this really deep karmic connections that are also full of drama. And I was definitely more interested in like having a durable, healthy, supportive relationship, which ended up being the relationship that I had. And again, I am not saying that, my ex was a horrible person, but it's more that it really taught me like what kind of relationship I wanted. And I think looking back, it's very much like 5th house in Capricorn. Like I want something durable, I want something trustworthy, I want something that I can count on, and yeah. And then Pluto was on my Neptune next, right, in 2015. And so looking back at this period, it was a very internal time. I did a lot of work behind the scenes on my album, lots of crying on the subway while writing songs. I was actually also studying at Columbia University at this time. So I was I was going back to school. I was studying something else entirely. I was studying economics. And I guess in that sense, you can consider this, a bit of a disillusion, right? Because writing my first album, I had to really contend with a lot of broken dreams and a lot of the ways that my dream life didn't really materialize. So during this period, there was a lot of like waking up super early to write songs. It was also a period of isolation because it was the first time that I truly had no audience. Like I had moved out of this grad student housing that I used to live in, and I used to perform a lot there, and I had this huge, like very 11th house and 3rd house community. And then during this time when Pluto was on my Neptune, I was completely devoid of that. At the same time, I was also going to a lot of different music shows with my partner. So I don't know, this was a period of a lot of uncertainty. I was not a good producer. I wouldn't really consider myself a great producer now either. And also I really was not a good singer. Like at that point, I hadn't really taken voice lessons, so I didn't really know what I was doing with my voice. So there was a lot of really weird experimentation here. Like I remember recording my whole album with like a really bad mic and not knowing how to sing. And that was kind of a shit show of a combination. Also thinking about the archetype of like Neptune and Capricorn, to me there's a lot of like maybe this figure of this person who is dreaming alone and dreaming, tending to the etheric visions by themselves. And that was what this period felt like to me. And then Pluto was on my Saturn between, the middle or February 2019 to early 2020, like January 2020. So this was a really interesting period actually, because this was when things really started to materialize with regards to my creative endeavor. I actually released my album on March 1st, 2019. So just a couple days after Pluto was exact on my Saturn. I was playing a lot of shows during this time. I was doing everything that I thought I was supposed to do. So like there was a lot of like checking the list, right? Like I submitted my music to a lot of music blogs. I tried to find a publicist and things like that. I played tons of weird venues in New York. Often this is so funny to look back on, but often I was playing only to my partner and maybe like one other friend, right? I was just lugging my keyboard from one bar to another. Yeah, there was some fond memories there, but it was also kind of cringy in some ways. And really, I think there was a lot of like dissolving or cracking around my idea of like what it means to be, you know, the hardworking musician, right? What does it mean to like take your music out there, and like what are the ways that I don't know, like all these blogs or like these music column advice is telling me to do about how to release my music and how to interact with people, that I was just realizing during this time did not work like at all. Right? Everything I tried was just kind of like throwing things into the black hole and then nothing came back, you know? I also started to be really interested in my spirituality. And this was around the time when I found lots of foundational materials. I found transcendental meditation, which was, I would say, my first really serious meditation practice. Prior to that, I had been practicing meditation with the app Headspace. Because, you know, I mean, I'm a Pisces sun. Of course I meditate, you know, but it wasn't something that really stuck with me until I found TM. And then I started reading Eckhart Tolle, and I remember being really blown away by his books and his ideas at that time. I read Julia Cameron, and I know you know this, Jacqueline, but the whole story about me reading Julia Cameron, getting dreams from my grandmother, finding Britain magically on through Google, right? And then realizing that me, my grandma, Britain, Julia Cameron, we all shared the same birthday. That was around this period. I think working with Britain was also really fabulous. I would say that was like a really beautiful moment in this period of Pluto on my Saturn, because it was like, I don't know, astrology really started to become like an obsession and an interest, and studying myself also started to become a huge interest for me. In January 2020 was also the last time I traveled abroad, right? Since the pandemic, I traveled with my partner, and little did we know the world was going to fall apart, right? So, yeah, like I think Saturn in Capricorn really wants to have a lot of structure. And when Pluto was on my Saturn, it was interesting because it really thwarted my idea of what that structure needs to look like. And then finally, the last point I'm going to make here is Pluto on my Mars, right? So this one is actually a really long transit. It was like from March 2020 to about let's see, November 2021. And this was a total and complete overhaul of how I did things specifically related to my creativity. And when I talk about creativity, I'm also talking about like our erotic life force, right? The thing that we do, since I know you, Jacqueline, it's like the things that we do that we know are going to be like humpable, right? And to me, that's also like a Mars thing. And I started studying astrology very seriously. I had actually studied astrology quite a bit before then too, but it wasn't something that I really studied. Like, you know, with my Gemini moon, I was just buying all these books, right? Reading a bunch of different chapters from the books. And it was much more kind of like free flowing. But this was really the time when I started to like sign up for courses, right? And then build relationships with different teachers, listen to various podcasts, and be very like concerted about my effort there. Pretty quickly, energy work and tarot also came right after. In the middle of 2020, I released a music video, and that did not go as planned. Even though I was super excited about it, I was I remember creating this insane spreadsheet to promote my music video. And, you know, I don't think I got what I wanted. And somehow it propelled me further into my spiritual path, because it felt like, oh, if music wasn't really happening, let me just allow myself to really dip my toes into these spiritual things that I'm really interested in, right? I just kind of went inward and turned all of my creative energy into studying all the things I was passionate about. And then I started sharing. I got lots of support from others, from teachers, from friends, from strangers. And for the first time, people willingly offered to pay me for something that I love doing. And that was a bit of a shock for me. And I think this really feels to me like Pluto on Mars, because it was like thinking about Pluto as the modern ruler of Scorpio, right? And then Mars being the traditional ruler of Scorpio and also the ruler of Aries, right? Both modern and traditional. And then also my Mars was actually exalted in Capricorn, right? So it's interesting to see how, when Pluto was visiting my Mars, it was like I started to become exalted. I don't know. I mean, that's such a weird word, right? But like I started to get recognition, I guess, in a creative pursuit that I was really deeply passionate about, but my ego didn't think that's where I wanted to go. And it also, I was, where I wasn't really supposed to go, it was just quickly like de-energized, which was really sad when it happened, but it quickly aligned me to where I needed to be. Something I also remember, and I want to share here because maybe this will be interesting, is that when I was younger, I used to really want to be a writer and a speaker. But I remember feeling too embarrassed, like somehow I needed to look better or to sound better or something like that. And in many ways, astrology has really helped me recover this, childhood dream aspiration of mine of kind of being this bard, storyteller, minstrel figure, right? I don't know. It's really interesting, and also even thinking about like the name that I use for my music project, which is Nate Chi, right? Like that name is still sticking until now. And then afterwards, when Pluto finally left, those exact conjunction period with Mars, I launched Healing the Spirit. So that was really interesting to me. Looking back at all of them, I think Pluto really smashed me. I had been so many different people and doing so many different things with my creativity through this transit. So yeah, I would say it's definitely been a long journey underworld within this area of my life that is the fifth house of creativity. All right, I hope that you found this episode to be interesting, thought-provoking, helpful to you. As a reminder, there are a bunch of other Q&A episodes around this episode, really from episode 26 to 31. So if you want to hear me talk more about different questions that people submitted, feel free to really find the topic that's interesting to you. And if you're resonating with this episode, definitely check out Astrology as Praxis. It's going to be a year-long journey of learning astrology, integrating astrology, understanding both yourself and the world around you using astrology as a framework for, really practicing what it means to be human. Britton and I would love to see you in the container if you resonate with our voices. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate, review this podcast, and if you're on Apple, I would love to receive your review. Something new that I am currently creating is some content that I will share with you as a gift if you write some reviews. So if you do write reviews, please take a screenshot before you submit it and then send it to me on healingthespiritpodcast@gmail.com. And then I will get back to you when the bonuses are ready. Just want to say that this is a practice that I find inspiring from one of my teachers, Sabrina Monarch. So I'm like, I want to do the same too. And it will be a totally different content, obviously. But just naming Sabrina as my inspiration for reciprocity. Until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself. And I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.